On this channel, we cover a lot of American history, but one often overlooked piece we haven't touched on is the conflicts between the First Nations people and America's cruel military actions, political games, and lies that were used against them. While there are quite a few incidents worth exploring and learning from, today we're going to focus on the Wounded Knee Massacre. This tragedy may have marked the end of large American military skirmishes against the First Nations people, but the societal trauma Native people endured manifested into rampant alcoholism, drug addiction, juvenile violence, and chronic unemployment, especially at the Pine Ridge Reservation, which is located close to the massacre site. In this video, we will focus on the background, triggering events, the massacre itself, the aftermath and legacy of this terrible piece of American history. December 29th, 1890. On the frozen plains of South Dakota, the winter wind cut through the silence like a blade. The snow lay deep and unbroken, save for the footprints of a Lakota band huddled together for warmth and safety. They were cold, hungry, and weary, but they were not expecting what was to come. By the end of the day, the stillness would be shattered by the roar of gunfire and the screams of the dying. The white snow would be stained red. What the U.S. Army called a battle, history would remember as a massacre. Wounded Knee was more than a single day of bloodshed. It was the violent climax of decades of broken promises, cultural destruction, and unrelenting pressure on Native peoples to surrender their lands, their freedom, and their way of life. It marked the final tragic chapter in the American Indian Wars, but its shadow still stretches across the generations. By the late 19th century, the Lakota Sioux had been pushed to the brink. Once they roamed the Great Plains freely, following the vast herds of buffalo that sustained every part of their lives, from food and clothing to tools and shelter. But U.S. expansion had been relentless. One treaty after another was broken, and each decade brought new waves of settlers, miners, and railroads that carved up their homeland. The buffalo were slaughtered on an industrial scale, sometimes for their hides, sometimes for sport, and often simply to starve the tribes into submission. By 1890, only a few hundred remained on the plains. The U.S. government reduced rations at the reservations, leaving many Lakota families in the grip of hunger. The traditional way of life was under assault from all sides. Children were taken to boarding schools, where they were forbidden to speak their language. Spiritual ceremonies were outlawed, and resistance was met with military force. It was in this atmosphere of despair that the ghost dance movement took hold. Led by the Paiute prophet Wovoka, it promised that if Native peoples danced the sacred circle with faith and discipline, the white world would pass away, the buffalo would return, and their ancestors would rise from the earth to live again. For the Lakota, it was more than a prophecy. It was hope. But for the U.S. authorities, it was seen as a threat, a sign that the Sioux were preparing for war. The tension reached a breaking point in December of 1890. U.S. officials, convinced that the ghost dance was a spark for rebellion, ordered the arrest of key Lakota leaders. On December 15th, Sitting Bull, perhaps the most famous Sioux leader of his generation, was shot and killed during an arrest attempt at Standing Rock Reservation. His death sent shockwaves through the Lakota Nation. At the same time, the U.S. military began moving large numbers of troops into the reservation areas. The 7th Cavalry, Custer's old regiment, still carrying the weight of the Little Bighorn defeat, was among them. Orders were clear: stop the ghost dance, disarm the Lakota, and restore control at any cost. Chief Bigfoot, known among his people as Spotted Elk, was already gravely ill with pneumonia when he decided to lead his band of about 350 Miniconjou Sioux southward to seek refuge with Chief Red Cloud at Pine Ridge. They were a mix of men, women, children, and elders, most of them unarmed, many too weak to fight. On December 28th, they were intercepted near Wounded Knee Creek by the 7th Cavalry, led by Colonel James Forsyth. The soldiers surrounded their camp with more than 500 troops and 4 deadly Hotchkiss mountain guns positioned on a nearby ridge. Bigfoot was told to camp for the night and to prepare to give up all weapons in the morning. The morning of December 29th was bitterly cold. A pale winter sun rose over the encampment, glinting off the frost-covered grass. The soldiers began moving through the Lakota camp, collecting rifles and searching teepees. The process was tense. Some men handed over their weapons willingly. Others hesitated, knowing they would be left defenseless. The flashpoint came when a deaf Lakota man, Black Coyote, refused to give up his rifle. Accounts differ on what happened next. Some say he didn't understand the orders. Others that he was angry about the way the soldiers were handling the weapon. In the confusion, a shot rang out. No one knows for certain who fired it, but the effect was immediate and catastrophic. The 7th Cavalry opened fire from all sides. The Hotchkiss guns thundered, spraying the camp with shells that tore through teepees and bodies alike. Soldiers fired rifles and revolvers indiscriminately. Many Lakota men were cut down where they stood, but women and children were also targeted as they tried to flee. Some were chased down across the snow-covered prairie and killed hundreds of yards from camp. The chaos was so great that soldiers were struck by their own gunfire in the confusion. When the smoke cleared, the creek banks and open fields were littered with bodies. Official counts put the Lakota dead at around 150, but eyewitnesses suggested the true toll may have been over 300, more than half of them women and children. In the immediate aftermath, the U.S. Army called it a victory over hostile forces. The newspapers of the day echoed the government's line, describing it as a battle. In the months that followed, Colonel Forsyth was briefly removed from command but quickly reinstated. 20 soldiers received the Medal of Honor for their roles, an award that to this day remains one of the most contested in U.S. history. For the Lakota, Wounded Knee was not a victory nor even a battle. It was the violent end of an era, the final armed resistance of the Great Plains tribes. Survivors buried their dead in mass graves, often in frozen ground too hard to dig deep. The massacre became a symbol of everything the United States had taken: their land, their freedom, and their future. Though armed conflict on the plains ended here, the cultural war continued, in the boarding schools, the courts, and the political battles over sovereignty that still rage today. Wounded Knee's meaning did not fade with time. For Native communities, it became a sacred place, not just of mourning, but of resilience. Generations told and retold the story, making sure the names of the dead and the details of the massacre were never forgotten. In 1973, Wounded Knee returned to the headlines when members of the American Indian movement occupied the site for 71 days. Their demands were clear: an end to government corruption on the reservations, enforcement of treaty rights, and justice for centuries of oppression. The standoff was tense, sometimes violent, and broadcast to the entire world. It was a reminder that the wounds of 1890 had not healed. They had been passed down. Today, Wounded Knee stands as both a memorial and a warning. The mass grave remains, marked by a simple monument. Each year, descendants and supporters gather to remember, to mourn, and to ride the trails of their ancestors. For the United States, it is a chapter of history that demands honesty. a reckoning with the myths we tell about the closing of the frontier and the lives that were taken to make it so. And as for the reservation, which was greatly reduced in size through seizures by the American government, continues to bleed. With rampant alcohol and drug abuse, unemployment reaching the 90th percentile and more, the tragedy is just as palpable as it was decades ago. But there are heroes who have emerged in this community, fostering education, spiritual guidance, and a connection to the past. I have left links to videos in the description if you'd like to learn more. Thank you for watching. If you learned something, please like and share this video. Subscribing to the channel really helps as well. See you next week.